Assalamu alaikum. I'd first like to start off by introducing our speakers. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr, who has lectured at RIS several times in the past, so many of you know him just from your experience here, is University Professor of Islamic Studies at the George Washington University. He has published over 50 books and hundreds of articles in the fields of Islamic studies, mysticism, comparative religion, and many other subjects. And in addition, he has mentored countless students in a career spanning over 60 years. Dr. Bruno Guiderdoni is a scientific researcher and scholar of international stature whose main research field is in galaxy formation, a subject in which he has published more than 140 papers and organized several conferences. In addition to his scientific work, he has also published dozens of papers and given many lectures on Islamic subjects in France and elsewhere. Our two speakers both come to this subject from two sides, you might say. Dr. Nasr began his academic career in the sciences, having graduated from MIT with a degree in physics, and then getting a master's at Harvard in geology and geophysics before moving on to a PhD in the history and philosophy of science, before returning to Iran, where he continued his academic work while also studying in the traditional Islamic fields with traditional masters. Dr. Guiderdoni embraced Islam, and please correct me if I have this detail wrong. Around the same time, he also became a professional astrophysicist. And alongside his professional work, he has done much to cultivate an understanding for the public of Islam's emphasis on knowledge as a unified activity, and he's given many lectures on Islam's view of nature and its attitude toward knowledge and inquiry. And with that, I'd like to invite our speakers to the stage. This is a vast subject, and we have these two great minds with us to discuss something which we could really spend the entire conference talking about. But I did want to get started. Dr. Guiderdoni, if you could help us just with terminology, and if you could tell us what is modern cosmology, just as a definition. What is it? What is the modern understanding of it, and what does it include, and also what does it exclude?
Maybe we can go back to the etymology of the word cosmology. Cosmos in Greek means a whole which is ordered and beautiful. And the Greeks were thinking that the world was beautiful. And now, after a long period of absence of interest for cosmology during the 19th century, we have the possibility to describe the universe around us on very large scales. This is modern cosmology. And the landscape that we discover is amazing because we see a universe which is much larger than what we were thinking in the past. And this universe is full of galaxies and stars, hundreds of billions of galaxies. Each galaxy includes hundreds of billions of stars, hundreds of billions of planets. And so we have this view of a large and old universe, and this universe is still a cosmos because it is ordered by laws, and the origin of the laws is still a mystery for modern cosmology, for modern science.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nasr, your first book was called An Introduction to Islamic Cosmological Doctrines, which was one of the earliest significant contributions to the study of that area. But could you describe what is meant by cosmology in the traditional sense?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, before I begin, I want to say that I'm very happy to be able to be here, Dr. Guiderdoni. his spiritual teacher, the late Abdul Wahid Pahlavichini, was like a brother of mine who came to Islam, the gift that Allah Ta'ala gave me through my discussion with him in Tehran in the 1960s. So we have a spiritual link together, although he speaks from the point of view of Western astrophysics. I speak from the point of view of traditional Islamic cosmology. As that point of view which I'm presenting to you. Of course, both of these uses of the word cosmology, goes back to the Greek word cosmos, but I want to emphasize that the word cosmos in Greek has two meanings. One is order and one is beauty. One is order and one is beauty, both of which are emphasized very strongly in the Quran concerning God's creation. Ma khalaqna hadha batala, God says in the Quran, it's in truth, not in butlan, in error or falsehood, that the world is created. And says God is beautiful, his creation is also beautiful. So the Muslims inherited this term, but that it was not used in Arabic, but the ideas behind it, they incorporated with the Islamic idea of the cosmos, and from that was born Islamic cosmology. In our tradition, cosmology is really the science of all that is other than God, Masawallah, all that is below the level of the absolute divine reality of God, which transcends the cosmos, is cosmology. And therefore, by definition, it embraces not only the physical world, the visible world, and not even only the psychophysical world, but all the worlds and grades of being, the angelic, the archangelic, the imaginal, and so forth and so on, which over the centuries, the Islamic thinkers have developed extensively. Islam has one of the richest resources for the study of cosmology in the traditional sense. And for us, the cosmos is a totality, of which the modern cosmos, with all of its extension of millions of years and billions of zeros added, is like a speck of dust on the ocean compared to the vast reality of the world beyond, and of course, beyond that, God. But there's one thing which we, and of course Dr. Guiderdoni is a very devout Muslim, but in addition to that, being a scientist, a major scientist in the world in his field, agree upon, those scientists who are theistic, is that this vast cosmos is created by God, and sustained by God. Where its laws come from and so forth are other matters of difference. But it's very important in this short debate, unfortunately, we have together, to distinguish between the very term cosmology as used in Islamic languages, al-Malkawn, and so forth and so on, and the use of cosmology as it was transformed during the Renaissance, from the cosmology and cosmography of the Renaissance, with all the books published in his original country, Italy, and gradually in the West after Galileo.
Thank you very much. Dr. Guiderdoni, this is an open-ended question, but I wanted to ask, what does Islam get right about cosmology that modern science gets wrong about cosmology?
As Professor Nasr was saying, the vast expanses of space and time that we observe is just one level of reality. It's a lot of space, a lot of time, a lot of matter, but it's a thin layer, a thin plane in the multiple states of being which are described in Islamic thinking and especially in Islamic mysticism. This world, with respect to the divine pedestal, is like a ring thrown in the desert, كحلقات ملقاة بأرض فلات, a ring thrown in the desert. So we are seeing a large expanse, but this is material quantity, and this physical world is not self-sufficient because it is ordered by mathematical laws, and we don't know the origin of these mathematical laws, except if we are a believer. Because for a believer, there is wisdom, there is intelligence in the cosmos. And the origin of his intelligence and wisdom is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-Khaliq, al-Musawwir, the one who creates, the one who gives shape to the things. So this is fundamental because, unfortunately, in modern cosmology, we have lost the sense of the ontology, the sense of metaphysics. People are so fascinated by the results of modern science that they don't ask anymore the fundamental questions about what is real, what is the meaning of our lives, why is the cosmos so beautiful, what does it teach to us, what does it mean for us as individuals, as human beings on the spiritual journey towards God. And that's the problem with modern science. It's not so much the method of science, it's not so much even the results of science, because these results change, they are changing, they are improving. Sometimes we ask questions, sometimes we have the answer, and the answers to our questions give birth to other questions, so it's an endless quest. The problem is with the interpretation of science and the use of science in society. These are the problems. And since we have lost the metaphysical perspective, we are doing a lot of wrong with science. We are thinking that science is leading necessarily to atheism, which is not true, and we are using science for the development of a materialistic society, which is not the goal of knowledge. The goal of knowledge is to bring us closer to God. And that's the problem with modern science.
Would you like to the question was, what does Islam get right about cosmology that modern science gets wrong about cosmology?
Much that he said I agree with, but I am a bit more radical in my criticism. Because in modern science, if you're a serious scientist, the question of God or the spiritual world is irrelevant. That is, a science considers itself to be independent of metaphysics, of religion, of revelation. There are individuals Christians who are both physicists and theologians, or Muslims like him, or devout Muslims and astrophysicists. That has nothing to do with the field of modern science itself, which draws from this cosmology. Is a worldview independent of any agent outside of the physical world, which it considers to be the only reality. Going backwards to the bifurcation of the car, in which you put all the qualitative value-laden aspects of life in the subjective pole, in the cogitans, res cogitans, rather than res extensa, the world out there, the world of extension.
So you mean when Descartes, in the early modern period, he separated the world essentially into the world of machines.
That's right.
And the world of minds.
You see, before the 17th century in the West, even before modern science really arose in the hands of Descartes and Galileo and those people, the worldview of Christian West, the Christian West, very similar to that of Islam. St. Thomas Aquinas, after all, read Ibn Sina, and over 500 references to Ibn Sina, 500 in the writings of St. Thomas, the founder of Catholic theology for 700, sustainer Catholic theology for 700 years. I mean medieval Catholic theology, not St. Augustine, of course. Now, in that time, this extreme separation between the knower and the known, in the Cartesian sense, did not exist in Western thought. There was a relation between the subject and the object. And Thomism, St. Thomas, others write extensively about this. Very similar to Islamic view. There must be a relation between al-alam wal-ma'lum. The word in Arabic for the world is al-alam. That which can be known is related to the act of knowledge. And alam, he's an alam, he's a scientist, a scholar. There has to be a relation through ilm between the two. Now this was in a kind of pseudo-miraculous way, you might say, in a kind of magical way, done away with. And so the aspect of the relation with the world of nature was reduced to the fact that somehow the subject can know the world of nature without anything of the world itself being related to the world of nature. It's somehow out there. And most scientists have not been able to evade this. There are now some new, some modern physicists in quantum mechanics, like our friend Wolfgang Smith, who was going to be here. He may have, I don't know whether you've read some of his works, remarkable physicist, who in fact says that it goes back to the error of this bifurcation, and there is no ultimate separation between the knower and the known, and Islamic cosmology is based on that. So we are critical of this truncation of the very methods of knowing the world, and also reducing what can be known to only the material, to the res extensa. There's been a lot of expansion, but really all of modern science, strictly speaking, goes back to the expansion of the meaning that Descartes gave to res extensa. And we do not accept that, because we believe that human intelligence given by God is such that it's even able to know God.
So in a sense, what happens is the world of nature, the world of the stars, the world of the cosmos just becomes cut off. There's no real way to account for how it is that we as people, as human beings who have knowledge, can even have a relationship with that world, much less be able to say something absolute about it and say something about its nature. And actually, this trajectory brings us to my next question, which is this kind of ultimate reduction of things, not only to mind and to matter, but then mind is, in a sense, washed away and you're left only with matter. And you have statements like the following, which I want to ask your opinion on since it relates to cosmology. And this is a quote from Stephen Hawking, about whom there was a film recently, and he's one of the most... Stephen Hawking, who says, because there is a law, such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God. And then he continues. Now, this is really, people, because of the prestige of science, because of the prestige and the fame of people like Hawking and his scientific achievements, they think that statements like this and many other similar statements have a kind of firm grounding to them. But really, it's a purely philosophical statement, and in a sense, a kind of absurd philosophical statement, because he's saying that you can have spontaneous creation from nothing. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I was wondering if you could both respond to that statement of Hawking and its problems.
It's a typical example of those philosophers and scientists that Imam al-Ghazali was mentioning in his book, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. Those scientists who are venturing out of a range of validity of reason to utter statements about God which are not valid. And so the message proposed by Imam al-Ghazali centuries ago is still valid for today, for this kind of scientist. It's absurd because there cannot be creation in physics, creation of something from nothing. There is no nothing in the description of the universe by Hawking. There is the law of gravity. There is the gravity field. And the nature of the fields is something very puzzling in science. So who created the law of gravity? Who created the law of gravity that makes the universe structure, the galaxies appear, the stars, the planets? We don't know why there is a law of gravity. We don't know why there are laws in nature. This is something very puzzling for the materialists. Of course, a few centuries ago, laws were designed as our own description of matter. But now we cannot speak about matter without mentioning the mathematical structure of matter. Matter is nothing more than mathematical entities. Where do these mathematical entities come from? It's something very puzzling. And Hawking is not mentioning that. It's a kind of a smoke that he is putting on the real problem of modern science, which is not addressing the origin of the laws. And for a believer, of course, the laws come from the lawgiver. I mean, there are the Sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to rule in creation, to rule creation with habits, awa'id, with habits. And these habits are described by our mathematics, but there are these habits, there are these regularities, which are God's trace in the world. And so science does not lead necessarily to atheism. It's true that most scientists now are atheists. It's true. Most scientists are materialists, because most of our fellow citizens are atheists and materialists. They are not better, the scientists are not better than the other people. But it's not a necessary conclusion, a necessary interpretation of modern science. And the hope is that we can address science to put it at its proper level in the scale of knowledge. It's not a very high level. We totally agree on that. There are levels of knowledge which are much higher than that because, of course, as human beings, we are engaging in a journey towards the knowledge of God. This is our goal as human beings. But we have to address the issue of science. Otherwise, we are going to be in some way polluted by science, either because we doubt our religion or because we become fundamentalists that we don't want to hear about science, or, and that's more subtle, because we are polluted by science in our own religion. We import scienticism within our own religion. For instance, when we say, okay, I know that the Quran is true because there are scientific statements in the Quran. Subhanallah, it's not necessary to see the truth of the Quran. The truth of the Quran comes from its beauty, from its light. It doesn't come from science. And this is the kind of subtle influence that we have to identify in order to protect ourselves and to put scientific knowledge at its proper level.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guiderdoni. Dr. Nasr, Dr. Guiderdoni mentioned Ghazali, who in this context is very important. Ghazali is even mentioned by modern popularizers of science, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, as being responsible for the backwardness or the anti-scientific attitude of Islam, because his criticism of philosophy and of natural philosophers, he says, destroyed the spirit of rational or scientific inquiry in the Islamic world. And this even makes its way into modern political attacks against the Islamic world. It makes its way into the sort of tirades of Islamophobes. Islam is anti-rational, it's anti-scientific, and so forth. I was wondering if you could say something about the way in which Ghazali features into this story of Islam's relationship with science, and maybe dispel some of the misunderstandings that arise in this connection.
Because you're asking one of the most important questions which faces people who are trying to study Islam today, including a large number of younger Muslims in the West who are studying from Western sources. This is a long story. I have to shorten. We really do not have time. But Ghazali was sort of picked by Western Orientalism as a key person to study the Islamic intellectual life from a very particular point of view. And people like Goldsmith or other famous Orientalists concentrated much of attention on Ghazali and the criticism of rationalism and of reason. And the story was like this. All right, for a while, Europe and the Islamic world were like sister civilizations, but then there came along Ghazali, prevented the Muslims from thinking, and Europeans did not have a Ghazali. Unfortunately, they produced Albert Einstein. That's the heart of this asinine, very stupid argument. In fact, it's a much more profound question. Why is it that Descartes was not born in Khorasan? Why was he born in Paris? Why was Galileo born in Italy and not in Egypt? I've written a lot about this, but I have no time to go into it now. But in fact, it is the presence in Islam of a knowledge of a sapiental order, of gnosis, of ma'rifah, of philosophy in the traditional sense of hikmah, that in fact prevented this from happening. What Ghazali did was not to destroy rational thought. He destroyed the possibility of rationalism, which is a very different thing. If the Westerners are unhappy that Ghazali did that, they should be happy. Otherwise, as I said, the atomic bomb would have made in Khorasan, Oppenheimer would be from Neshabur. That could have happened historically. The question is that Ghazali attacked the power of rationalism to stand opposed to tenets of faith. He had read Ibn Sina. He wrote a book on logic, Ghazali. He's not illogical, he's not Ibn Taymiyyah, Raddu ala al-Mantiq, refutation of logic. He wrote a book on logic, Ghazali. It wasn't that he was against thinking. He was a turning of the stream in which Islamic thought essentially turned more and more towards inwardness, toward Ashraq, to the school of illumination, to other modes of thought, to tasawwuf, while not disbanding science, because in the 13th century after Ghazali, you have Qutbuddin Shirazi, Nasruddin Tusi, the whole revival of Islamic science. Some of the greatest physicists in the field of optics in the history of science lived actually after Ghazali, Muslims. So this is not what happened. And finally, this is an important issue. Now that the blind application of modern science is killing us all. If Galileo had remained only in the library, there would not have been the environmental crisis that we have. But we have the application of all these things. As soon as something is made in order to make money, it's applied no matter what its consequences for the world in which we live. Now that we have this crisis, we should be intelligent enough to say, thank God there was a Ghazali who prevented from the Khorasan becoming as polluted as Detroit. If you look at the history of the world altogether, you will see that if the rest of the world had started like the West with the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, we would not be around right now. And the fact that the Islamic world, which has such a remarkable science in physics and mathematics and astronomy, you know very well, if you had continued allowing and developing a kind of science independent of the religious worldview, like the West did, we would not be around. The whole earth would have been destroyed. So I don't want to make a virtue out of necessity. There have been great Islamic thinkers who have been critical of Ghazali, including Mullah Sadra, but also defenders of some of his ideas. This idea that Islam stopped thinking because of Ghazali is totally false. I mean, you're a scholar of Islam, you know yourself. Also, not only in Persia, because I mentioned Mullah Sadra, in the Sunni world, all the later philosophical Sufism that developed in Egypt, in the Maghreb, and so on and so on, is very much related to Ghazali and related to the intellectual life for centuries of a part of the world, a very large part of the world.
Just to follow up on that, Dr. Nasr, I want to ask you and Dr. Guiderdoni two related questions. What should the Islamic world do? What should the Muslim majority world do in this area in terms of steps to take, maybe in education or in policy or what have you? In other words, there's a sense in which, at least philosophically, you both definitely agree that in this respect, in modern cosmology, it's on the wrong track, I mean, intellectually speaking. What are steps or approaches that one could take to correct and to head in a better direction?
We have now a major crisis in the Islamic world, because in some countries, you have both the madrasa system continuing and the modern educational system. In some countries, the madrasa system was destroyed or modified to a large extent, like in Libya, President, we're not going to special examples. But the general public, which goes to state-run schools or now private schools in a Western style, all they're studying is Western science. They're not studying traditional Islamic science. Islam is 2 hours on the Sharia, you study how to make ablutions, which is very necessary, alhamdulillah. At best, a little about ethics, but not about the nature of reality. the Islamic understanding of the nature of reality, what metaphysics really is not taught in schools in the Islamic world. But belief is still there. The vast majority of people still live in that world, and that's why you have an inward paralysis that has been created by introducing the Western educational system, run mostly by Catholics now. I've said that often, in Pakistan, a country in which 4 million people died because of partition, in order to create it. From the time of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Pakistan is like my own country, I can speak openly about it. 90% of the children of the elite of Pakistan, generals, heads of banks, ministers, and so forth and so on, go to Western schools, go to Catholic schools. 90%. It's as if 90% of all Americans went to a Wahhabi school in Texas. That's exactly what is happening. But what we should do, I think, is 3 steps. So first of all, revive our own educational system in its fullness. We should have a contemporary madrasa, like Mustansariya or like the old Azhar, all subjects. In Al-Azhar, physics was taught in the 5th Islamic century. It isn't like now where they teach only Islamic law and things like that. Secondly, on the basis of that, then to study Western subjects. And so look upon, know the Western subjects, but know it from an Islamic point of view. And thirdly, to be able then to create arts and sciences which are rooted in our own tradition, but also take into consideration what is positive that Western science has developed, shorn of the limitations which its worldview has imposed upon it. This would be the ideal program. And I've talked about this for so many decades that 1 or 2 places in Malaysia, other places, that small experiments in Pakistan right now, in Iran, they're trying to do it. But we need a much larger engagement in this matter, and inshallah it can still be done.
Dr. Guiderdoni, anything that you wanted to say on that topic, but especially I had a question for you about many young Muslims. They tend to prefer going into the sciences, either engineering or they go into other fields which are in the sciences. And as we know, science is not only a method, it's not just a pure set of practices, but it's a community. It's a set of institutions. There's a kind of authority within it. And it's not always easy if an individual wants to make his way through that as a believing Muslim, as someone of faith coming from his own principle. Even within modern science, even for those who are not people of faith, those who hold heterodox ideas about, let's say, the nature of galaxy formation or quantum mechanics or what have you, they're often ostracized or they have a hard time, practically speaking. And so the central part of my question is, what are some ways that Muslims who are actually in the sciences right now and who don't really have a real, how can they cope with their situation? Like, how can they shield themselves and guard themselves or frame their practice so that they can have integrity within themselves, but also while being able to succeed or do well outwardly in their profession?
The problem is that universities in Europe and the US and Canada have lost their true meaning, which is universal. They are not universal anymore. You were mentioning the fact that in the old madaris, in the old schools, every field of knowledge was taught to students, from metaphysics to mathematics and physics, going through Sharia, Kalam, and so on. And so we have lost that in the major universities of the world. We have lost the universality of knowledge, and we have restricted ourselves to very specific levels. There is a list, I don't know what context, a list of all the sciences which are currently developed in universities. There are 3,000 different sciences, 3,000 different branches of science. And so we are training experts in one very specific field and total ignorance in all the other fields, especially in what is the ground in which knowledge grows, which is metaphysics. We are in need of metaphysics. And my hope is that in the development of the new development of universities in the Arab Islamic world, this vocation of the universities to reach a real universalism is going to be fulfilled. The universalism, yeah, we can also play on the etymology. It means versus unum, towards the one. Normally, the university is the place where you can integrate all the fields of knowledge within the perspective of a tawhid, which is the very essence of metaphysics. We have that in our tradition. Unfortunately, we go through Western systems, either in the West or in the Islamic countries where the Western system has been imported, and we train people who are fragmented. They are just studying one thing, and they are very anxious about the whole perspective because they don't have the training in metaphysics. So back to metaphysics, especially now that we are facing a very specific moment of the history of humankind. We are challenged by many different crises at different levels. An economic crisis, a social crisis, and a cultural crisis, all the crises, and obviously also the crisis of our relationship with the environment and with the sacred character of nature. And so we have to train our young people to address these questions, not the questions of the past century, but the forthcoming questions. How are we going to share limited resources in peace and justice on this earth? And for that, we need metaphysics. We need to understand that the meaning of our lives is not consuming or over-consuming. It's the embellishment of the inner self. And that's metaphysics, which is teaching us this lesson.
Dr. Nasr, earlier, Dr. Guiderdoni made a reference to the scientific interpretation of the Quran and was critical of it. But I think maybe the audience would benefit maybe from a few more minutes of discussion about what is this thing called the scientific, tafsir al-ilmi, the scientific interpretation of the Quran, because the Quran, as everyone knows, is replete with references to the world of nature. The Quran swears many oaths by different parts of the world of nature, and some commentators really went very far in trying to make modern science and the Quran somehow coincide or have a very particular relationship. I was wondering if you could just say something about the history of that and its ramifications.
I'm glad you brought this issue up, because this issue is really an intellectual weakness and even evil that still exists in the Islamic world in certain quarters. It began in the 1890s in Egypt. And a person who was professionally a doctor called Al-Iskandarani wrote a tafsir al-Quran based on scientific interpretation of verses of the Quran which pertain to the science of that time. At that time already, since the science was coming from the West, since the West was powerful, and with the military machine was destroying the Islamic forces wherever it went, power usually brings with it obedience and respect, unfortunately. A lot of Muslims in their heart had respect for modern science without even knowing what it was. Beginners already in the 1890s, in India a bit earlier. Anyway, India had nothing to do with this particular issue. After Al-Iskandarani's work, a number of apologists, you might say, in Syria, other places, then in India itself, and in Iran in the 1830s and 40s, began to write commentaries defending Islam on the basis that the verses of the Quran accorded with scientific theories or truths. Now, this is something of a suicide, because people who know science know that the results of modern science change all the time. If you read Al-Iskandarani now, it sounds absurd, because Newtonian physics is no longer accepted. Even said that Seyyed Nursi, the famous Turkish commentary on the Quran in his early treatises on the Nursi treatises. He would defend the Newtonian physics as a kind of proof of the reality of Islam. And then he realized it was stupid. He said, I'm a new Nursi. This was very prevalent. And also the idea of taking pride in the fact that Islam developed science. And it goes, the logic, if you reduce to cynicism, would be the following. The West is great. The West says that science is great. Therefore, science is great. Islam produced science, therefore Islam is great. So Allah Akbar is reduced to Al-Gharb Al-Akbar. It's the West that is great, not Allah. That's really the gist of the whole argument. And it's very dangerous, still goes on. In my own country, Iran, if somebody invents some gadget, many of the president of Iran's leading university in sciences, which is now called Sharif University, the most brilliant young Muslim scientists and engineers were there, unbelievable, as half of them are now in Stanford and MIT. If someone invents a machine, you know, not only does it get an award, it's on television, but there's a great contribution to Islam. Well, it's not a great contribution to Islam at all. The machine could cause a lot of harm later on. But the idea of taking pride in that we're doing what the West thinks to be important well, because the West is important, because we have an inferiority complex toward the West. Let's sit down and take a mirror of our face and realize it. We have to overcome the inferiority complex. And we have some brilliant young Muslim minds. I have a lot of hope in them. But it's important that they be weaned away from this drug that they have been given without their knowing it in their education, and try to stand independently on their own feet and be able to be critical of not only something that Western science might say wrong or does wrong, but also of the Islamic interpretation of that. Whereas you are a young Muslim scholar, you know very well the reverse is taking place in this country. We have a lot of young Muslim scholars who have gone into the field of Islamic studies, and they make the Western interpretation of things Islamic, but with an Islamic name, the way of getting ahead in the academic world, which is a very, very dangerous thing. But the West, there's the motto of medieval West, which I love, that says, "Winked omnia veritas." إذا جاء الحق وذهق الباطل, as that verse of the Quran. The truth shall always triumph, inshallah.
Dr. Guiderdoni, in the couple of minutes we have left, is there more that you would like to say on the subject of how the sacred scriptures and their relationship to the world of nature, and how it is that Muslims in some cases get it very wrong as to what that relationship should be, and like how they really should be approaching it?
Sometimes people come to me and they ask me this type of questions. Students in science who are Muslims, young Muslims, about which one is true. Is science true or is religion true? And the point is that maybe we have to think a little bit more about what truth means. Because truth in science has a bit vanished during the 20th century. As you know, we can't say that our theories are true. They are corroborated by the facts until new facts appear and we have to change our theory. So that means that science, it's more than mere opinion, but it's not truth. It's just something which works until it is disproved by the facts. If we have that in mind, we can put science at its proper level in the scale of knowledge. Whereas religious truth is the capability of religion to lead us in our spiritual journey to the contemplation of the one who is the truth, that is Al-Haq, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the definition of religious truth. All the doctrines, all the practices of religion have a single goal, that is bring us to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the meaning of truth. So if we have that in mind, I think that we are not, we should not have troubles with science. We should, on the contrary, use science for what it is. That is maybe for practical purposes, maybe for the amazement in front of a beauty of nature, of a beauty of a cosmos which is unveiled by science. But it should not change our hearts, and it should not put us astray from the spiritual journey, because this is the most important thing that we have to do in our lives. We do not have any guarantee that we can understand everything in the world. But we have a promise in the Holy Quran that we will face God and we will know Him. This is something which is amazing.
Alhamdulillah, thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers for a wonderful panel. Thank you so much.